Marcus Ellison was 39 years old when he handed his wife a certified check for $1 million and watched her take it without hesitation, without a single question about where it came from. He drove a 9-year-old Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a rear bumper he had replaced himself. He kept his work boots in a plastic tray by the back door and wore the same navy canvas jacket through October and November. Her friends called him Quiet Marcus, Steady Marcus, sometimes just the contractor, and she never once corrected them or told them a different version of who he was. She had taken 2 weeks to make her decision. She had consulted a lawyer, packed the guest bedroom, and positioned herself at the breakfast table that Monday morning with a posture that suggested she had already moved on. She slid the divorce papers across the table like she was returning a library book. She asked him to sign. She told him it had simply run its course. What she did not know was that Marcus had been sitting on the other side of that table for 11 months. He had known about the arrangement for 11 months and said nothing. He had spent that time doing what he always did when a project required precision. He had worked quietly, and he had built something she would never see coming. She signed the check over to her account that same afternoon. $1 million. Clean and documented. She had no idea that 48 hours later he would close a deal worth $900 million, and not 1 cent of it would have her name on it. What happened next would cost Vanessa Ellison everything she believed she had secured. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came through the kitchen windows at an angle that Marcus had always liked. It hit the tile backsplash he had laid himself 6 years ago, Carrara marble in a herringbone pattern, and turned the whole wall into something quiet and deliberate. He stood at the counter with his coffee held in both hands and watched the light move across the grout lines, each one level and true, the way he had set them over a long weekend while Vanessa was visiting her sister in Savannah. He was a structural engineer by training and a builder by temperament, which meant he understood that the most important part of any structure was the part no one ever saw. The load-bearing elements. The foundation poured before the walls went up. His father had told him that once, standing in a half-finished house on a Tuesday afternoon when Marcus was 11 years old. His father had said, "The things that hold everything up are always the things buried deepest." He had spent his career building that way. He had spent his marriage that way too, and somewhere along the line Vanessa had confused his invisibility for smallness. He had met her 12 years ago at an industry fundraiser in Charlotte, a Tuesday evening event in a hotel ballroom where he had gone reluctantly at the urging of a colleague. She had been working in development at a nonprofit focused on workforce housing. She laughed at something he said before the entrees arrived, a real laugh, surprised out of her, genuine and unguarded. And he had driven home that night thinking about the shape of it, and what it meant that a woman he had just met could already make him feel like he was worth knowing. They had been married inside of 2 years. They had built a life in a beige brick house in a subdivision off Route 74, the kind of house that looked ordinary from the road and was, on the inside, full of things Marcus had built himself. The deck off the kitchen. The mudroom shelving with the cedar inlay, the tile wall in the shower that ran floor to ceiling in a pattern he had drawn freehand on graph paper before he ever touched a single piece of stone. He had not noticed the signs for a long time. That was the honest accounting of it. He had been absorbed in a project in Raleigh that had run 6 months over its window, a mixed-use development that had required his full attention and his full patience. And while he was building something in Raleigh, something in Charlotte had been quietly disassembled. He noticed the perfume first. Not a new scent exactly, just a different concentration of it. worn on mornings when she told him she was going to the office. He noticed how her phone rested face down now at the dinner table. He noticed the second car in a neighbor's driveway 3 doors down, a silver sedan he did not recognize. Twice in 1 week on afternoons when Vanessa said she was working from home. Small details. The kind of things a man who spent his career reading structural drawings learned to notice. The hairline crack that appears in a wall 2 weeks before anything moves. He had a doorbell camera he had installed the previous winter, positioned to cover the front approach and the right side of the driveway. He had put it in after a rash of package thefts in the neighborhood. He had not thought about it once since installation. He thought about it now. He had not said anything. He had gone back to Raleigh on a Monday and returned on a Thursday, 1 day early, and parked 2 streets over and walked through his own side gate at 10 minutes after noon. The side gate had a new keypad lock he had installed himself, and the code was still the same. He stood in the kitchen for 11 seconds before he walked back out. His hands did not shake. His face remained perfectly calm. He drove to a coffee shop 4 miles away and sat at a corner table for 2 hours. He was not angry in any way he recognized as anger. He was measuring. He was calculating load and stress, the way he had always done, because he was a structural engineer and because his father had taught him that the first response to any structural failure was not panic. It was documentation. That same evening, he reviewed 3 weeks of doorbell footage from the cloud archive. He watched with the same careful attention he brought to reviewing construction plans, noting timestamps, cross-referencing the comings and goings against the texts Vanessa had sent him on those same days explaining her whereabouts. The timestamps told a different story than the texts. Not dramatically different, just consistently, methodically different. The kind of difference that required planning and coordination and the particular discipline of someone who had been doing this for long enough to get comfortable. By the following Monday, he had recovered phone records through a method his security consultant had once outlined for a corporate client. A legal mechanism he had filed the paperwork for through Patricia's office before he said a word to anyone. By Wednesday, he had a timeline. The timestamps ran back further than he had expected. 14 months. The relationship had begun, as far as the evidence suggested, 14 months ago, during the 6-month stretch in Raleigh, when Marcus had been working 18-hour days on a project that would eventually win a regional design award his name was on. 14 months of deliberate, practiced deception unfolded before him across a spreadsheet he built methodically, date by date, the way he built everything. There was more. He cross-referenced bank statements from their joint account, the account Vanessa managed, because they had divided the household finances that way years ago, when the arrangement had seemed sensible and efficient. He found withdrawals that did not correspond to any household expense he could identify. Not large amounts at first. 200 here, 300. Then, larger. The pattern became clear across 18 months of statements. $67,000 had moved out of that account in patterns designed to be invisible, designed to stay beneath the threshold that would require documentation, designed by someone who had done research into how financial monitoring worked. He sat with that number for a long time. $67,000, carefully extracted from a shared life, moved to somewhere he could not yet see. He opened a new folder on his laptop. He named it simply Foundation Work. He picked up his phone and called the one person he knew would understand exactly what he needed. Patricia Okafor had been practicing family and corporate law in Charlotte for 22 years, and she had been Marcus's personal attorney for 9 of them. She was a compact, unhurried woman who spoke in the kind of measured sentences that courtrooms responded to, and that adversaries underestimated at great cost. She had reviewed the prenuptial agreement he had drawn up before the marriage, which Vanessa had signed without much examination, because at the time it had appeared to protect only modest assets. A man with a used truck and a canvas jacket did not inspire anxiety about hidden wealth. They met at her office on a Wednesday afternoon, in a conference room with a long table and a view of uptown through glass that had started to fog at the edges from the cold outside. Marcus set the manila folder on the table, and Patricia reviewed its contents without hurry and without expression. She said, "She signed this prenuptial agreement in full." He said, "She did." Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Marcus, I need you to understand what you're holding here." He understood. He had built the whole thing himself. What Patricia needed him to understand was the full legal weight of the second structure, the company. Marcus had established Ellison Capital Partners 14 years ago, before the marriage, as a holding vehicle for a series of infrastructure investments he had begun making in his late 20s with inheritance money from his grandmother. Money he had grown slowly and with enormous patience across a decade of careful positioning in commercial real estate and construction logistics in 3 southeastern states. The company held assets. The company held equity stakes. The company had, over those 14 years, grown into something that bore almost no relationship to the modest F-150 in the driveway, or the canvas jacket, or the 9-to-5 presentation Marcus had maintained, without effort, because it was simply how he lived. He had never seen the need to present differently. The work was real, whether anyone knew about it or not. Vanessa had never asked. In 12 years, she had never once asked where the second phone came from, or why the inner pocket of his jacket always held a device she had never touched, or why certain calls he took in the garage lasted 40 minutes and left him looking the same as when he had walked in. She had built a picture of who he was based on what she could see, and she had stopped looking for anything below the surface, the same way most people stopped looking at foundations once the walls were up. Patricia explained that the prenuptial agreement, properly executed and witnessed and notarized at the time of signing, meant that every asset held by Ellison Capital Partners was entirely outside the marital estate. Every dollar, every project, every equity stake in every property in Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. All of it had been disclosed by name on the prenuptial agreement Vanessa had signed. Marcus nodded slowly. Patricia said, "The $67,000 she moved from the joint account is recoverable. The joint account is marital property, but the withdrawals were fraudulent transfers under state law, and we have the paper trail to document each one." She looked at him evenly. She said, "What do you want to do with the rest?" He said, "I want to finish the project." Real power operated in quiet rooms. He drove out to Greensboro the following Saturday to see his Uncle Raymond, who was 71 and retired and lived in a house full of books and a workshop where he built furniture by hand, slowly and with attention, the same way he had always done everything. Raymond had known Marcus since he was 3 years old. He had stood at the head of the church when Marcus's father died and had never once offered false comfort. "Only true things," said plainly, in whatever amount the moment required. Marcus sat at the workshop bench on a stool he had sat on as a boy and told Raymond the short version. He did not editorialize. He presented the facts the way he had always presented project updates, clearly, in sequence, without drama. Raymond sanded a piece of cherry wood for a full minute before he responded. The sound of it filled the workshop. Even and steady, he said, "She took you for someone who wouldn't know what to do when you found out." Marcus said yes. Raymond said, "The error most people make when they've been underestimated their whole life is they feel obligated to explain themselves at the end. They want the other person to understand what they missed. Don't explain. Just finish the work. Let the work speak to itself. Marcus drove home with that settled in him, like ballast. By Thursday of the following week, Patricia had assembled the legal architecture around the reckoning. The prenuptial agreement remained the foundation. The fraudulent transfer documentation was complete and filed. There was a second element Patricia had surfaced through a forensic accountant named Desmond she had retained on similar cases before, the man Vanessa had been involved with. A developer named Greg Poole, who operated in Charlotte's commercial real estate market and presented himself with the ease of someone who had learned to make surfaces convincing, had a documented history of civil fraud judgments in Georgia. 2 prior instances. A pattern of leveraging personal relationships to access capital he then redirected through entities that dissolved before any accounting could be done. Desmond had found a woman in Atlanta who had been defrauded of $43,000 through a pattern that matched what he was seeing in the foundation work folder almost exactly. Poole had been using Vanessa as access. He had also been using the joint account as a secondary channel, and $67,000 had not all traveled to the destination Vanessa believed it had. Marcus sat with that information for a long moment after Patricia finished explaining it. He said, "Does she know?" Patricia said, "Probably not everything." He said, "It changes nothing about the legal picture." She said, "No, it doesn't." He drove home that evening and made dinner: roasted chicken, rice, green beans from a can, because he had not been to the grocery store in several days and the pantry was running down. He set the table. He asked Vanessa about a fundraiser her organization was planning, and she described it in the kind of detail that suggested she was not thinking about him at all. And he listened, and he answered her questions about the Raleigh project that had long since finished, and the whole performance was so practiced on both sides that it had a kind of terrible dignity to it. The dignity of 2 people running separate calculations at the same table while keeping the surface absolutely still. He kissed her cheek when he went to bed. She had no idea that in 48 hours the largest transaction of his professional life would close, and that not one clause of the agreement, not one line of the documentation, bore her name. The deal had been 14 months in development, a $900 million infrastructure acquisition involving a portfolio of toll road concession agreements and logistics hub properties across 4 southeastern states, assembled with 4 institutional partners, and a structure that had required the most careful legal and financial architecture Marcus had ever built. He had been working on it during the same 14 months Vanessa had been working on her own separate project. 2 people in the same house, building in opposite directions, unaware of each other's blueprints. She brought the divorce papers to the breakfast table on a Monday. She had prepared them. She had already signed them. She set them in front of him and asked him to sign and told him it had simply run its course. She did not look uncomfortable. She looked like someone executing a plan they had been patient about. He signed. He slid them back. Then he said, "I have one request." She looked at him with the expression of someone who believed they had already won. He said, "I'd like to give you something. A settlement, outside of what the lawyers have already sorted. A gesture of good faith for everything we built together." She said, "Marcus, you don't have to do that." He said, "I know. The certified check was for $1 million. She accepted it without asking what account it came from. She did not ask what assets he had, or what else might exist, or what the prenuptial agreement she had signed 12 years ago in a downtown Charlotte law office had actually covered in its full 3 pages of disclosed holdings. She had no idea. Not even close. The reckoning did not happen at a table with thrown documents or raised voices. It happened in a conference room on the 31st floor of a building in uptown Charlotte at 9 in the morning on the day after the close, And Vanessa was there because Patricia had sent her a formal letter informing her that there were marital asset disclosures she was legally required to attend before the divorce filing could be finalized. She arrived in a tailored jacket and heels, the kind of outfit that said she was expecting to receive something good. Greg Poole was not with her. Greg Poole was in a mediation room 3 floors below, meeting with a woman from Atlanta and that woman's attorney over a civil fraud complaint that had been filed the previous Tuesday, the documentation for which had been prepared by a forensic accountant named Desmond, who had spent 3 weeks building the case from records that Marcus's team had made available through proper legal channels. Vanessa sat down at the conference table, and across from her sat Patricia and Desmond and Marcus in his canvas jacket with his coffee, the same as any morning. Patricia laid the documents out one at a time. She did not rush. She placed each one flat on the table and let it settle before she moved to the next. The prenuptial agreement, executed and notarized at the time of marriage, covering all assets of Ellison Capital Partners, which was listed by name and registration number on the second page under the heading of separate property not subject to equitable distribution. The fraudulent transfer documentation. $67,000. 18 months of patterned withdrawals, each one cataloged by date and dollar amount and cross-referenced against household expense records to show the discrepancy. 19 separate transfers, each one structured to avoid triggering automatic review. Desmond had built the timeline on a single laminated sheet, and he placed it face up on the table without comment. The Ellison Capital Partners Annual Report, current year. A document Vanessa had never seen because she had never asked to see it, because in 12 years of marriage she had never once looked below the surface of what Marcus presented. Marcus watched her face as she read the number on the cover page. He watched the understanding arrive the way structural failure always arrived, not all at once, but in a sequence. One load-bearing point giving way, then the next, until the whole picture settled into a new and irrecoverable shape. Patricia said, "The prenuptial agreement is airtight and fully executed. Every asset of Ellison Capital Partners, including the full proceeds of a transaction that closed yesterday morning, falls entirely outside the marital estate. The $1 million check you accepted was a voluntary gift. It carries no legal weight in either direction. It does not affect anything else." Vanessa looked at Marcus. She said, "You never told me any of this." He said, "You never asked." She tried then. He had expected her to try because he had built the space for it deliberately, so that whatever she said would be witnessed and documented by people in that room who would carry it accurately. She said it had been a mistake, that she had been confused, that Greg had been manipulative, that she had not fully understood what she was doing with the account withdrawals. She said she still had feelings for Marcus. She said she thought perhaps they could work through it if there was space for an honest conversation. Her voice found the registers that voices find when the option being reached for has already been closed. Patricia slid a document across the table. She said, "The fraudulent transfer claim is filed with the court. You have 30 days to respond. Your attorney of record will advise you on options." Vanessa's mother, a quiet and dignified woman named Gloria, who had been called by Marcus 4 days prior, and who had sat in a chair by the window through the entire presentation without speaking a word, stood up. She walked to the table and placed one hand on the back of her daughter's chair. She said, "Vanessa, stop. Let this man go." Marcus stood. He gathered his coffee cup, which was still half full. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Vanessa one final time, not with triumph, not with anger, not with the particular coldness of a man who wanted to be seen winning, just with the steady, clear attention of someone who had finished a piece of work and was ready to move to the next one. He said, "I'm not angry. I'm clear. Those are different things." He walked out. He did not look back. The room was quiet behind him. Vanessa remained at the table, surrounded by the paperwork that mapped the precise shape of her own demolition, and Patricia began explaining the next steps to her in the measured, unhurried voice she used when the work was already done. 9 months later, Marcus closed on a craftsman house in the Dilworth neighborhood of Charlotte. A corner lot property with a yard that needed everything and a kitchen that needed more. He spent the first 3 weekends there alone with tools, no radio, no company, just the sound of what needed to be done and the satisfaction of addressing it one task at a time. He had already drawn the tile pattern for the kitchen wall on graph paper, a running bond in soapstone gray, and he had ordered the material to arrive the following Friday. He had hired 12 new people at Ellison Capital Partners in the 9 months since the close, expanded operations into Virginia and Tennessee, and funded a mentorship program that paired young engineers from working-class backgrounds with senior professionals in the firm. He had attached his grandmother's name to a building in Greensboro. He had visited Raymond twice, and they had sat in the workshop and built nothing in particular, and said comfortable things, the way men do when there is nothing left to prove. A woman named Celeste had come into his life the way things came when he was not looking, gradually, through consistent proximity, through conversations that started as professional and became something slower and more deliberate. She was an urban planner for the city who asked specific questions and then listened to the full answers. She did not perform anything for him. She had not asked about the annual report. She had asked about the tile in the shower of the old house after he mentioned it once in passing, and when he described the herringbone pattern and how he had laid it over a long weekend, she had asked a follow-up question about the grout spacing, which was the kind of thing that told him she was actually listening. He heard about Vanessa the way he heard about most things he was no longer tracking, through a third party, a former colleague who mentioned it without drama over a lunch they had scheduled for other reasons entirely. The nonprofit board had requested her resignation following a financial audit, which was what financial audits sometimes produced when someone's personal habits had developed in a particular direction over time. Greg Poole had settled the Atlanta civil claim for $31,000, admitted no wrongdoing per the terms of settlement, and relocated his operations to a smaller market in South Carolina. The circle of friends who had once gathered at Vanessa's holiday parties and called Marcus quiet and steady and forgettable had contracted to something much smaller. Her mother still called Marcus on his birthday and at Thanksgiving. He answered both times. He did not gloat. There was nothing in it worth gloating over. He registered the information the way he registered the settling of a completed structure, noted, documented, filed, and then returned his attention to whatever was next. On a Saturday morning in late spring, Marcus stood on the unfinished back porch of the Dilworth house with a coffee he had made at 6 in the morning and watched the light come through the oak trees in the backyard, the same slow, angled light he had always liked. The kind that asked nothing of you and illuminated only what was already there. The yard needed work. He had a plan for it, sketched on the same graph paper he used for everything, bamboo on the western fence line for privacy, a raised bed along the south wall, a Japanese maple he had already selected and was waiting to plant in the right season. He had built everything worth keeping. Some things, he thought, were worth the patience to build right. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.